So today we're going to talk about context, because context is one of those things that for most of us it goes entirely unnoticed. This is actually part of the problem with a lot of our conditioning. We are often taught at school, for example, we're taught a whole lot of what we call content. We're taught about different facts or bits and pieces, but we're not taught so much about how those bits and pieces fit together. So what is a context is really important, because when we first begin to think about context, it enables us to line up all of those facts and figures so that we can make the most effective use of them. It enables us to create alignment in our life so that we can be more effectively we can get more effective results regardless of whatever we're dealing with. One of the things that we say in Fractology is there is one answer for every single question, and that answer is it depends. And one of the things I often say to my students is it's our job to figure out what it depends on, but primarily what it depends on is the context. So an analogy of the context is, say you're looking out at a garden through a bay window, and so the different windows are angled into the garden slightly differently, and so it might be the same garden, but we will get a different view of the garden from each window. That's what a context is. It's a little bit like this, my little blocks here. So if our context is, say, a particular context, which gives us a certain viewpoint. Now, context can often be relative to the situation. Often when we're dealing with our own integrity and our own development, it's relative to our purpose. But if we have this kind of context, that will create a particular kind of alignment, because as this context, it just naturally holds things in a particular way. Now, if we change that context, things will just naturally then be aligned in a different way. So this is the way that context works. It creates alignment. Now, with our own life, one of the big contexts for all of us is often actually what we perceive life to be. When we are in different stages of development, we actually perceive the context, or if you like, the meaning of life to be quite different, meaning, purpose of life. So if we see that life is, well, one of my brothers used to say, life sucks and then we die. Well, that's a particular context, and that will align your experiences and your path through life in a particular way. But what if we have a different context? What if we have more like the Fractology context, which is that life is an ever-expanding and evolving experience of inspiration and co-creation. It's about mutual expansion and realising ever-deepening levels of joy. Well, now that's a completely different context. And so that's going to line our life up in a very different way. And that alignment in itself, it will create meaning, which will help us develop more understanding and lessons. But the lessons that we learn are inherently bound up in the context. One of the biggest problems with codependency is that because codependency has this right-wrong thinking with it, that only works if we only have one context. Now this often worked for our parents and well, maybe not our parents, but certainly our great-grandparents, maybe even our grandparents, because in those days life did not change that often. But these days life is changing constantly, and what is appropriate in one setting is not appropriate in another setting. And if we're going to be truly effective, if we're going to be able to create the results and the life that we want for ourselves, we need to be able to think contextually. Now, this is not something that we've been taught of a lot in life. There are a couple of areas in life where it is apparent. One is in our high school algebra. It's all right, I'm not going to make you do algebra, but if you do remember a little bit of your algebra, you may remember that before you did your quadratic equations and stuff, there was the first line. Now that first line is actually the most important, at least as far as context goes. Because that first line was, if x equals 2, or if x equals z, or if x equals z squared plus 3, then you would do the same steps with as you were working through your quadratic equation, and you would end up with a very different answer. This is how context works, because we line things up according to the context. If x equals this or if x equals that, that's what tells us what our context is. And then we apply principles. In fractology, we use a few different holographic principles, but we apply them to each different situation according to the context, and we get our particular answer. So the other area in which most of us are aware of context is actually in art, particularly, for example, what they call found object art, where you find a piece of something interesting in the trash, and you rework it in a different setting with a few other things, and you create what they call a found object sculpture. And that derives its meaning from the change in context. So in many ways, art has been working to teach us to consider the context of things. And if you think about many of the different problems that are going on around the world, it's because we are often arguing about what is right and what is wrong. But the problem is that in context, in this context over here, if x equals z, we get one particular thing being right and another thing being wrong. But if x equals y plus z, then different things are right and different things are wrong. So once we can learn to think about context, our ability to understand every situation and therefore get better results increases significantly. Being able to think contextually is what enables us to work with the integrity of each person and each situation and get the results that we're after with greater inherent alignment. By considering the integrity of each person, like a different context, we are able to work in such a way that we enhance not only our integrity, but the integrity of everybody involved, and still get the results that we're after. A simple example would be one of the things that my mother used to tell me when I was quite young. She was constantly saying, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Well, yes, that's true, in the context that you're only buying one cake. But all we have to do is change the context, and you can have your cake and eat it too. You just change it to the context of you buy 2 cakes, or the context of maybe even buying a whole bakery. So if we're ever stuck for an answer or a way forward, it's because, without realizing it, we've allowed ourselves to get stuck into one context. Because as soon as we change the context, we create, remember, a different alignment. And that different alignment then allows us to create different results, often more expansive results.